I'm Ellen Duke-Benfield, and I am an independent consultant. I have been working on basic needs and access to public benefits and low-income college students for over 20 years now, which gives you a clue how old I am. I used to work for Higher Learning Advocates in Washington, D.C., where I was the managing director of research and policy. Before that, I was at the National Skills Coalition, the Hope Center, as well as the Center for Law and Social Policy for a long time. So I'll turn it over to my colleague, Richard.
Thanks, Amy Ellen. Hey, everybody. My name is Richard Davis Jr. I am currently a policy analyst on the higher ed team at New America. Before that, I was a senior policy associate with Higher Learning Advocates. And prior to that, worked on college affordability issues at Invest in Louisiana, a think tank in my home state focused on college affordability. And super excited to be here for this conversation.
Tanya, should I take it away?
Yeah, well, one more second. Just excited to have you both here today. I was again muted and had to unmute myself. But the Today's Students Coalition was formerly Higher Learning Advocates, and in the last 6 months, did a rebrand under the Today's Students Coalition. But we were very thankful to be able to publish this report from Amy Ellen and Richard, and are really excited to have you both back with us to have this conversation. So Amy Ellen, I'm going to ask you first, can you talk to us a little bit about the impetus behind the report?
Sure. This report emerged from a growing recognition that addressing today's students' basic needs is critical to their educational success. Research has consistently shown, and I know some of you on this call have actually done some of that research, it's consistently shown that students dealing with food insecurity, unstable housing, or insufficient access to childcare are significantly less likely to persist or complete in their post-secondary education. These challenges are compounded for students of color, first-gen students, and parenting students who already face systemic inequalities. States are actively addressing basic needs at a scale much larger than even a few years ago, but policy action varies across states. States play a valuable role in ensuring there's a robust infrastructure for delivery of basic needs resources through a variety of approaches, including but not limited to providing direct grant funding that increase the equity of the provision of support, changing state policy governing public benefits like SNAP, which we'll talk about in a little bit, so more students can access things like SNAP and childcare subsidies, and offering professional development on best practices to institutions and faculty and staff. Additionally, they can provide funding, well-developed guidance, and set expectations for the quality of services.
And also in developing the report, we also aim to highlight how states can create systemic solutions to these barriers, moving beyond just those institution-specific efforts, which are really important. But the goal was really just to equip policymakers and advocates with a roadmap of scalable practices and inspire new ideas and collaborations.
Our methodology was rooted in legislative and regulatory research, which Richard did a lot of, and qualitative interviews. We never counted up how many, but I'm sure over 40, with state leaders, higher education advocates, and policy experts. We chose states based on several factors, including innovative basic needs policies and geographical and political diversity. For example, we included states like Michigan, which has invested directly in broad basic needs funding, and Oregon, which has created benefits navigators on campus, as well as states like Tennessee and Kentucky, which have conducted basic needs surveys or developed working groups. We did not, and what we are not, and for those who might say, why isn't our state on here? We did not include states without statewide policies related to basic needs, which is why you see some states aren't covered in the analysis. Some states like Idaho have some really interesting things going on at the institutional level, let's say at Boise State, but the state wasn't driving any of that. And so in the future, I think TSC is going to be looking at some of the systems more broadly, particularly around single policies related to single mothers. But for now, we really focused on what are state policies driving institutional actors.
This was a big project to undertake and ended up taking quite a bit more time than we had originally expected. But from it came so much information and some things that I think can really be capitalized and used to expand this type of work outside of even just the current states that are doing it, and being able to, instead of recreate the wheel, use what's already in existence. As you worked on this report, what stood out to you the most?
I would say like two things stood out to me. First, there's incredible variation across states in addressing basic needs and security. While some states and longtime heavy hitters like California have robust centralized policies, other states rely heavily on the ingenuity and also the limited capacity of institutions to help drive that work forward. And that variation really underscores the importance of tailoring solutions to both the state, local, and institutional contexts. Secondly, I would say for me, philanthropy played a pivotal role in seeding and scaling basic needs and innovations at both institutional and state level. Foundations such as NE Casey, Ascendium, ECMC, Ford, Gates, Joyce, Lumina, Strata Trellis, and various community foundations as well have provided so many critical funding opportunities to address basic needs insecurities among college students. And also, we uplift in the report, for instance, 5 national foundations, including Annie, Casey, Ford, Kresge, Lumina, and the Open Society Foundations, supported Benefits Access for College Completion Initiative, which was an initiative in the early 2010s. And that project really offered valuable insights into benefit hubs, navigators, and a need for public benefits policies to better serve college students with low incomes. And also, the ECMC Foundation has been really instrumental in fostering institutional level initiatives, including rubrics to help guide high quality basic needs interventions. Also, I would mention Lumina Foundation has supported multiple state level policies that prioritize racial equity in addressing basic needs. And many of the successful programs that we highlight in the report began as foundation piloted initiatives. And that really demonstrates the power of philanthropic investments to inspire and enable some of the systemic change. But it's also important to be paired with government support, both in terms of policies as well as funding opportunities.
Amy Ellen, how about you?
Well, one would be remiss in telling a story about the rise of state basic needs policies without underscoring advocates' importance in initiating and supporting system change. And I'm not just saying that because I spent the majority of my career as an advocate. Coalitions of advocates, some of whom are on this call right now, calling out Ruben from Cal Berkeley and Kate Kinder from NCWE in Oregon. These coalitions of advocates that range from anti-poverty and higher education activists to student government associations and even businesses have led the charge in developing benefits navigator legislation in Oregon, basic needs support grants in Michigan, and food support in New Mexico. Advocates have emphasized the importance of implementing enacted legislation, seeking out state funding for successful interventions. They have also asked states to measure the scale of need to have a foundation for advancing policies to address food and housing insecurity. They have also monitored implementation. This is a huge one as we see some states going back year after year to try to hone in on and improve policies that are already enacted. Policy and systemic solutions would not be possible without advocates.
That's helpful for those of us that do the advocacy piece. So why don't you go ahead and break down the report for us?
Sure. The report is organized into thematic areas related to a range of basic needs policies, ranging from data collection, awareness raising, and strategic planning to specific policies addressing particular needs, like housing, childcare, and emergency aid. I'm going to talk about that first bucket, and then Richard's going to go through some of that second bucket. Understanding the prevalence of need and the specific challenges facing students in a particular state can be crucial in addressing specific barriers. Armed with data, institutions, higher education systems, and state higher ed agencies have been able to make the case for more investments in basic needs. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about New Mexico, a state that we often don't hear about. In 2022, partially funded by the New Mexico Governor's Food Initiative, a team of faculty and students at the University of New Mexico conducted a year-long survey of the prevalence of food and housing insecurity at the 27 colleges and universities across the state. The data was striking and showed that most campus communities were struggling with basic needs insecurity. The survey results led to the creation of a formal statewide consortium of schools, government, and community advocates to achieve change. The New Mexico Basic Needs Consortium is joined together in a belief that by pooling their efforts, sharing best practices, and presenting a unified call for resources, their efforts will be more effective than working in isolation. A handful of state legislatures, including Tennessee, have supported the development of studies, working groups, and strategic plans. There's more detail about this in the paper. Initiated by a legislative mandate, the Tennessee Higher Education Commission conducted a statewide assessment that's actually on their website in 2022, focusing on food security's prevalence within the state's post-secondary institutions. By assessing the knowledge and experiences of campus administrators and students, THEC was able to highlight the current landscape of interventions and services in place to combat food insecurity among the state's students. They also were able to see where the gaps are. Additionally, the state agency, using its convening responsibility, convened a group of diverse stakeholders, including practitioners, researchers, and policy advocates and students, who drove the scope of a statewide assessment and informed the Commission's recommendations to the legislature that focus on policy, practice, and research. So hopefully a year from now, we'll get to hear, once the legislative session is over, more about Tennessee's successes built on a base of evidence. We also looked at basic needs centers and navigators. In response to widespread basic needs insecurity among their students, many colleges have developed basic needs centers and benefits navigators. Those are the folks that can help students identify community resources, public benefits, and other supports out in the community that they can connect students to address their basic needs insecurity. As with many state basic needs policies, basic needs centers and navigators were developed at the institutional level first, then scaled to the state level. Some of the foundations that Richard mentioned were those that helped seed some of those innovations. State policymakers can play a role in addressing students' basic needs by funding basic needs centers and using approaches similar to the benefits navigator model. California, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and Oregon have been leaders in developing policies to support centers and navigators across their states. I want to focus on one of these states because they don't get talked about enough. Sorry, California and Oregon. But Kentucky is the newest state to put benefits navigators on its campuses. It's funded by the state's Cabinet of Health and Family Services with Medicaid dollars. We have yet to find anyone else who is taking that approach. These connectors, K-Y-N-E-C-T-O-R-S, connector like Kentucky, assist students in applying for Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, Affordable Care Act, healthcare marketplace subsidies, SNAP, and childcare subsidies. The connectors are on every community and technical college campus, as well as 2 universities with a plan to expand to all the 4-year institutions. As with other state benefits navigators, they meet regularly as a community practice. One thing I also want to highlight before I turn it over to Richard, and those of you who know my work from Higher Learning Advocates know that I'm a passionate person about data sharing agreements as a means to better connect students to public benefits and financial aid when it comes down to it. The pathway goes both ways. So talking briefly about Washington, their Student Achievement Council, which is the state higher education executive officer organization, they have a data sharing agreement with the Washington Department of Social and Health Services, which is called DSHS. That's the state SNAP agency. One of WASAC's goals is to increase access for recipients of the state financial aid program, that's the Washington College Grant, to means-tested benefits. So what they're going to do in terms of this data sharing agreement is going to provide WASAC with information that a student is receiving the Washington grant does not receive SNAP or other state benefits. So let me explain that. They're going to share data in such a way that DSHS can look and see, here's a list of students. These are the students that currently receive public benefits. These are the students that, according to the means testing of the financial aid program, may be eligible. And so institutions will be able to do targeted outreach and support students not receiving SNAP or other benefits. Another data sharing agreement that went through in this legislation, which I think is really exciting, that will increase access to the Washington grant for high school students in families receiving SNAP. So if you're a high school student, you receive SNAP, you are automatically eligible for the Washington grant, which is basically free college in Washington. So I think that's pretty exciting development. We saw West Virginia do a little bit of that during the FAFSA snafu last year, but they didn't pass any legislation. I also want to flag for those of you who are going to read the report, Kentucky also has a great data sharing agreement in place too. Encourage you to check that out because they're going to try to use their data to also target students for benefits. Data sharing agreements are really dry and they're very hard to achieve between agencies, which is all the more reason as advocates that we should be reaching out to our state SHIO and state public benefits agencies to bring them together. I'm going to turn it over to Richard now to talk about how states are addressing particular basic needs and security for college students.
Thanks, Amy Ellen. I'll touch on the other 7 themes that we have in the report. The first I want to touch on is the broad-based basic needs support and funding. I want to kick it off with Michigan. So Michigan's approach stands out for its comprehensive scope and long-term vision for student basic needs. The legislature actually allocated $12 million for what they call barrier removal grants, including $5 million in competitive funding for institutions. And these grants support a number of basic needs areas, including emergency aid, childcare, housing, and food programs, with awards ranging for institutions between $100,000 to $400,000. Institutions have up to 3 years to use those funds, which can allow them to build capacity and develop those sustainable solutions that we saw that really meet students' basic needs. And that model really shows how flexible funding can empower the institutions to address those diverse challenges effectively, but also in different ways that meet students where they are. Also want to talk about public benefits access, which is another part of the report. So Alabama actually is developing a FAFSA integration tool. And what they do is look at all of the federal and state requirements for public benefits and identify students who may qualify for those public benefits programs. And then they will send targeted notifications with links to those actual public benefit applications so that students know where to go to fill out those applications and get that aid. And that process simplifies that process for students and also prioritizes independent students with dependents. Massachusetts also is doing a lot of work around public benefits access. They recently the Department of Higher Education sent out outreach letters and informed about 140,000 FAFSA filers about their potential SNAP eligibility, really breaking down those access barriers. And additionally, we talk about states like California, Oregon, New Jersey, who have used federal flexibility to expand SNAP eligibility rules, which states do have the flexibility to do, ensuring that more students can really access those critical benefits. And going on that same line around food insecurity. So, we know that food insecurity affects so many students and also can lead to impacts to dropping out, stopping out, or even lowering the academic performance. And so states are tackling with innovative approaches, including Washington State. As part of its Post-Secondary Basic Needs Act, Washington launched a pilot program which offers free and reduced cost meals to students with low incomes. And we often hear about that model for K-12 students, but this is really important for those post-secondary students who really need that support. Also, I want to mention Swipe Out Hunger. I'll be remiss while mentioning their work. Since 2017, Swipe Out Hunger has collaborated with advocates as well as state lawmakers in nearly 20 states to either introduce or pass legislation, which they call Hunger-Free Campus. And those efforts have funneled over $112 million into food pantries, awareness campaigns, and benefits navigation to allow students to help access aid, which really empowers institutions to address food insecurity in a holistic manner and not just kind of in one-off ways. Also, in the report, we talk about housing, which is also an important need for students. So states have adopted a range of policies addressing student housing needs. The most popular policy is establishing liaisons for homeless college students, which has tended to be a bipartisan approach and endeavor. A few states have developed housing funds, but these tend to be more limited in scope. And then also more recently, states have established public-private partnerships to increase the housing supply for those college students with low incomes. So I want to first start with California. So beginning with the fiscal year 1920 in their state budget, they allocated $19 million annually to public institutions to support what they call rapid rehousing efforts to address student homelessness. Also, the state of Oregon is addressing student housing affordability for support and development of those public-private partnerships that I mentioned with state dollars. And then other states have also prioritized student housing for formerly homeless youth and foster youth, such as California and Tennessee. And other states provide tuition grants and fee waivers for those homeless youth. And I also want to acknowledge our partners at Schoolhouse Connection, who have helped to drive much of this work forward as well. Mental health is also a big part of the report. As we know, since the pandemic, the demand for mental health among students has surged. And so states are really innovating and finding new ways to bring the support to students with funding, partnerships, and also new delivery models. So I want to shout out my home state, Louisiana. Their Department of Health have provided supplemental funding to public colleges in the state for mental health services. So this allowed campuses to expand telehealth offerings, launch awareness campaigns about the importance of mental health and to reduce stigma, but also partner with local providers to manage counseling caseloads, which we know are really overwhelming institutions across the country. Also in the state of Utah, so the University of Utah's mental health first responder program, or MH1 is what they call it, provides after-hours support for students in residence halls. So licensed mental health professionals address those really acute needs that students have around their mental health during times when the traditional campus and the services that the counseling center may provide are closed. And then also childcare. Childcare, as we know, parenting students are a growing and important population in higher education that needs more support and more recognition of their needs. And so states like Vermont, Texas, and Minnesota have really pioneered targeted supports for these students. So I'll start with Vermont. So the state has provided direct subsidies to colleges for childcare services, enabling those schools to offer affordable care to student parents. And this really removes a significant barrier for students trying to balance those family responsibilities with their higher education. The state of Texas also, their focus on childcare comes through partnerships between community colleges and local agencies to provide that subsidized childcare for student parents. Minnesota has a long-standing post-secondary childcare program that provides eligible student parents up to $6,500 per year per child. And that can be used for most providers, including friends and families and neighbors. And state policymakers have also passed legislation requiring improvements in streamlined data collection on student parents, which is really important to really not only understand the population's needs, but also communicate the support that's available to those students. And so Michigan, Oregon, Maryland, California, and there's so many others that have come out, have done legislation as well after this report was put out, have passed legislation to spur colleges to really collect that data and report it to the state.
Richard,
And then
can I
last,
ask you a question really fast around that?
yeah.
With the childcare and the food benefits and and those types of things, did you guys notice any ways in which the institutions, like working with the state, are doing outreach to students about that information?
You want to take that, Amy Ellen?
Yeah, definitely. If through benefits navigators they do this, or just this sounds so silly, but flyering on campus is another way that it's not the most efficient way for students to increase student awareness. Some schools also include information about reaching out to someone on campus. Let's say they don't have a formal basic needs center, but they have a navigator or someone who has an inclusion of basic needs in their job, and that that information can go out. That's on financial aid letters and other pieces of information, like when a student logs into the CRM that the college uses, or PeopleSoft, or that kind of thing. There's an alert that comes up that says, you know, did you know XYZ, and tells you where you can follow up on that. But I agree with Mike that student outreach is definitely challenging. That's very apparent. Like, we have some data on SNAP that shows that students grossly underestimate their eligibility for SNAP, partially because the rules are so complicated for students in SNAP. but also because there's just this assumption on a lot of students' part that they're not eligible. And as we see an increasing number of students who are not 18-year-olds coming straight out of high school, dependent on their parents, they may not know about the existence of public benefits, or there may be stigma related to accessing benefits or emergency supports or that kind of thing. Other people need it more than I do. So I think that would be interesting to have a little conversation. I know we're wrapping up here with our presentation period in a little bit, but one thing that would be interesting to hear from all of you is how you've done outreach around these policies too.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, Richard, go on. That was something I wanted to kind of like, I thought right after childcare, that was a good place to touch on. Having spoken with some schools and higher administrators who have struggled themselves to even know what's available for their students, let alone getting that information out to students. So yeah, that information gap. I was curious what had come up on that.
Yeah, and it definitely varies by institution too. I've seen schools that, they may have the capacity to have some folks who have the expertise of like how to navigate those benefits programs, like come to campus and help those students apply. But also it's a big capacity issue for folks like who are working on those campuses. They may not have the knowledge or an understanding of like the ins and outs of the programs to help students apply seamlessly. If they have questions, they really can't answer it. So it just depends on like the different institutions as well, I would say. Of course, and then the last thing I want to touch on was the emergency aid. Emergency aid, as we know, acts as a lifeline for students facing unexpected financial crises that could otherwise derail their education. And as many of you all know, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the federal government provided funding to support higher ed institutions and students through numerous legislation. And that provided more than $14 billion in emergency aid funding to higher education, with $6 billion of that being required to go directly to students in the form of emergency aid grants. But as this funding has been exhausted, states have really looked for ways to continue that source of funding, which has been, as we know, a vital lifeline for students. And one notable example is in Virginia. So last year, the state budget included language to allow each public college and university to use 1% of their financial aid allotment on emergency aid. And so that could lead to institutions spending up to $4 million annually on emergency aid. And reflecting that, Virginia has a decentralized higher ed system, institutions will have the flexibility to design their aid programs how they see to meet the needs of their students in unique ways. But the programs will provide direct grants for students for urgent needs like medical expenses, transportation, and housing. And the report highlights how these funds often are the difference between a student staying in school or dropping out. And so that covers all the themes of the report, and we definitely encourage you all to dive in and learn more about it.
So there's obviously there's been so much information that we can't even incorporate it into a whole webinar, right? There's a lot of information that we were able to find within this report, but was there anything that you found that didn't make it into the report but is worth highlighting or mentioning?
Yeah, there were a couple of things that I noted. One, I would say local variability and access to resources. So in many areas, county or regional administrative structures really shape how students access state level programs. For instance, some regions, they've excelled at connecting students with SNAP and other benefits, while others face capacity challenges in doing so. And those differences really highlight the potential for sharing best practices and creating tools that ensure more consistent support for students across all regions, like Amy mentioned, like data sharing agreements as well. Also, I would say innovative legislative approaches is something that didn't make into the report. We saw several creative approaches to policy adoption that could serve as models for others. For example, some states use budget allocations rather than formal legislation to fund student basic needs programs, which allow for greater flexibility in that spending. But this approach really emphasizes the importance of strong partnerships between states and institutions to really ensure that long-term sustainability and direction of that funding. And then also, I would say rural and parenting students are an area for growth. We also recognize, to focus more intentionally on the unique needs of rural parenting and rural colleges and parenting students, programs like flexible work study arrangements, transportation support, and childcare initiatives can have an outsized impact on those populations. And really expanding access to those types of supports could be a meaningful next step for states and institutions looking to close those equity gaps for those populations.
Thank you. Yeah, a common theme that keeps coming up, sorry, Amy, Ellen, I'll go back to you, that seems to keep coming up is a partnership, right? The partnership between the states, the local counties, the entities, and then the institutions themselves. And I think we could even broaden that on to like then the federal role within the whole place of again creating these partnerships from the federal to the state to the local to the institution itself or to the state system itself of how we can kind of like create a more robust system to make it easier for students to access what currently exists. But Amy, on
Yeah, one thing, I mean, I think Richard primarily covered it, but one thing that I would also say that didn't make it into the report, or maybe had one sentence, and that is that we hope that states and advocates and policymakers can look at this report and not feel overwhelmed or say, well, we're not California, we're not Washington State, we're not Massachusetts, and can see that all of states across the spectrum, small, large, flush, no one's really flush anymore, but flush, not flush, there are a variety of different interventions you can take. Some are costly, some are much less. And that there are a lot of different avenues in which people can come into this work and find space for their state or what they can handle at that time.
that's super helpful. Thank you. Yeah, like let's not let what other people are doing limit than what we ourselves can do. And I think it's that creative approach, finding creative ways to address an issue. And one of you, I think, I can't remember if it was Richard or Amy Ellen who mentioned, what was being done was very different among each state. And I think that goes to also like talking about the fact that what works for one entity may not work for another entity, but there are creative answers and ways that we can address some of these issues through that. As we're looking at moving forward, we have a brand new Congress, brand new administration. We have a lot of states with new members and new roles, leadership roles. Do you think that there's opportunity? And if so, what do you think that looks like for continued work in these areas?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is definitely opportunity out there. Though I will say the opportunities may differ depending on the state and the context. But despite the polarized political climate, I think there really is bipartisan support and recognition of the importance of investing in students' basic needs. Basic needs issues like food insecurity and childcare resonate across party lines because they directly impact workforce readiness and economic growth. And so there's also potential to align these basic needs policies with broader economic goals, such as investing in a state's post-secondary attainment or workforce participation. And I think by framing those investments as part of a strategy to build a more skilled and resilient workforce, advocates can definitely make a compelling case to policymakers across the political spectrum, especially given our current political makeup.
I think that's fair. Amy Ellen, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think one thing that I want to say is that even though the political environment is different in some states, is that racial equity is still a core goal for many of us in the advocacy sphere, even if you can't use that language anymore in states. But that addressing basic needs and security is inseparable from advancing racial equity. And that we know from some of the report that the Hope Center has done that students of color are disproportionately impacted by some of these basic needs challenges. And so we have to continue to push policies that will close those gaps, or we'll continue to see great inequities in terms of persistence and completion.
So in both of your opinions, you feel like that there is still quite a bit of opportunity over these next however many years to continue to push some of this work that's being done and expand it at states that might not be doing similar things and kind of sharing that information amongst those that are actively engaged in that work. I would agree. I think that conversation of there is a big focus on making sure that we have jobs for the American workforce, and in order to have those jobs, we need to make sure our American workforce is trained to meet those job requirements and the demands of that workforce. And removing the barriers of basic needs does really open up so many more opportunities for those that are looking to engage in some of these career paths where they're high demand, but maybe not as many that are trained in those areas. So I think that those are great. Thank you so much. We're going to open it up to questions right now. We did get one question already, and we really want you to jump in, share with us thoughts, whatever. Like, this is really opportunity for you to engage with all of us. But the first question we got was, are you aware of any state strategies to expand public benefits eligibility for students with limited access to these benefits, like non-US citizen students?
I am not. I mean, I know that it's going on separate. I mean, I know that it's going on in places like California, and Washington State have tried to continue to increase access. I'm trying to pull down the language of the. But the fact is, some of these programs are funded with federal dollars and still have bars on whether or not students can access funding. One program we didn't talk about today was temporary assistance for needy families, and that's the cash welfare system. And in some states, they have set up parallel cash welfare systems for non-citizen students who might not meet the, or even immigrant students who might not meet the strict federal requirements around eligibility. So, unfortunately, I think I'd point you in the direction of Migration Policy Center or maybe CLASP, where I used to work, that has really did a lot of work during the Trump administration around trying to maintain public benefit eligibility for non-US citizen students. But I would throw it out here to, if any of the folks on the call who are from states that are pursuing those approaches, to jump in here.
I'm not seeing a lot there right now, so please jump in if you feel like you can either share it or raise your hand and speak up. Let us know. My other question for you is, if you were to go back and do this report over again, I have two questions for you, but we'll start with this one. What would you have done differently, if anything? And do you feel like there's areas that could have been expanded upon even more?
Well, I'll let Richard, I guess I won't let Richard go first. I think, I do want to have a caveat that the 37, just because your state isn't included in the 37 states doesn't mean that it's not doing well. But we did suffer in a few states from people just not responding at all and trying multiple means by which to get in touch with folks. And that's hard in states that have decentralized systems, that don't have a real SHIO office, that don't really have a community and technical college system, or organizing body, let's say, kind of a membership organizing body or that kind of thing. And so I, wish that we'd had more resources to track some of these folks down, but I feel really confident in the literature and legislative review that we did, that we caught, everything that was out there law-wise, and regulation-wise. The other thing, I guess I would say is I think I would have liked in the paper to be able to provide a little bit more detail about funding streams for things, because I think that's always helpful for advocates, is to know, well, how exactly did they fund it? Like Kentucky using Medicaid dollars for those benefits navigators. That's huge when you have a state that can't put forth a standalone, several $million support for benefits navigators on their own. So I don't know, maybe more to come on that. Maybe check me out on LinkedIn and I might blog a little bit about it. But I think that's an area that we just didn't have time or resources to dig into that can be really helpful.
Yeah, and I would definitely echo Emil's sentiment about, I think in the states that we've tried to get more insight about like our trails ran cold essentially. And so I think I know there are like advocates in that state or, other folks working in different capacities to support basic needs. And it may not just be for college students, but just overall. I think like having more conversations with those folks to kind of see, even if we couldn't reach the folks at the state level or folks that we had initially targeted, finding those folks. And I guess one thing that I would also like to include, I know we talked a lot about programs and policies, but also for the policies that have been more established, I would love to also talk to more students to get their perspective and learn about, how they're experiencing this funding, how they're experiencing these policies, and incorporating that and seeing what improvements to those policies or programs could make. I think really a student perspective is really important in trying to figure out how to best implement these policies that have been passed, that we were so many innovative approaches and things that are new and novel. But I think making sure that it's reaching the students that are needed and who need the support is really important. So I love to talk to students as well.
Yeah, to echo that, some of the states that do have strategic planning boards or agent, like a cross-agency planning groups or that kind of thing, many of them often include students, which is reassuring to me. But I do think throughout this area of basic needs and security, we're definitely a lot better around student voice. And some of this has been driven by student advocacy, no doubt about it, in some of these states. But then to ensure that there's a continuous feedback loop, thinking about, I don't want to not acknowledge what Ruben raised about the challenges in California and thinking about that kind of stuff only comes out. He talked about the massive challenges in county social service workers, eligibility workers, training, retention, and capacity for the scale of college students that continues to grow. They're denying more students than they are approving SNAP. And so to try to dig into what are students' experiences around that, and how are they finding that they're being denied? Why? What can we be doing in response to that? That's pretty time-intensive work, and I think there's a base of advocates. And I feel good because I feel a little bit better because Ruben's there, but California is a huge state facing a lot of challenges. But the fact is that we need to provide more avenues for students to be able to say, okay, this law was passed, but it's not doing exactly what we need, or they're missing, for instance, like thinking about emergency aid program, let's throw out Washington State. Let's say students say, well, you're missing an allowable use that we think would be most helpful. Can you add this to the list? And so to continue to sort of hone in on what those needs are and allow the space for students to constructively criticize and play a key role in advising implementation is important too.
Yeah. That sounds good. And you both have started to jump onto my follow-up question, which is, as like after this report, there's always that like what's next kind of a thing. And to me, I feel like this report leads to a lot of potential opportunities for other types of things that we can continue to move forward on. One obviously is to continue to advocate, to continue to highlight what's being done in the different states. But what other, like in a perfect world, if you had your perfect opportunity, what would be next in your list of to-dos, like following up from this report? I know Amy Ellen's answer, so you can go ahead and
Do you know my answer?
I think I do.
Well, I think it would have been nice to be able to go back and document state system activities, and we would capture some of those other institutions, some of those other states. So I am curious, I guess I'm just naturally curious across systems what folks are doing and what that looks like funding wise at the institutional level and that sort of thing. Another next step is I'm going to be working with Tanya and the Today's Students Coalition, funded by the ECMC Foundation, to look at single mothers and policies at the state level to support single mothers in post-secondary education and training. And I know there aren't, from Richard's and my analysis, there really aren't a lot of policies out there for single parents, single mothers, single parents, period, beyond what are at some of the institutions. And so what are some of the intersectional policies out there that can help this population? So, drilling down on more on specific populations to make sure that those groups that do face the biggest equity gaps do have, a handle or a ladder by which to make it, further along in their educational training journey.
Yeah. That was my I that was kind of where I was leading with too. Richard, how about you? Like in a perfect world, if you had your opportunity to continue on with this work, what would that look like for you?
Yeah, in a perfect world, I would say one thing. So there were a lot of states that we talked to, and you'll see throughout the report that are doing similar issues, are doing working on similar issues. But what if we found, like we mentioned, like some states are doing this, some states are doing that, and they weren't aware of kind of how a state was operating. And so one thing that I would love to do is like I guess bring those states together or bring those like advocates together for like more like learning so they can see like learn from each other more in a more formal setting. And I hope that would inspire more innovation and more collaboration amongst those states. Just because they're doing such similar work, but are so I recognize that like working in state policy, it can be very siloed and you're focused on what you're trying to drive forward. But I think providing space for those institutions and those states systems as well and advocates to really learn from each other and figure out how they can push the work forward collectively would definitely be important. And also, similar to what I mentioned earlier, I think for the programs and policies that have been more long-standing, I think reaching out to students who have benefited from those policies and who can kind of share more qualitative data about how they're experiencing those policies, what they want to improve moving forward for those policies, and us being able to communicate those findings back to states so that they can kind of retool those different initiatives. Those in a perfect world, those would be my top two.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I'll ask for one more thing. And that is that states have a chance to do thinking and planning around this. And that's one thing, going back to when Richard mentioned Michigan and their basic needs funding, is that they're putting $5 million out there of the 12 million for colleges to build capacity and do professional development and build up the infrastructure to be able to provide these sorts of supports. And so I do wish that there were more opportunities for state policymakers to come together, even within a state, including bureaucrats and advocates and students, to think about what makes most sense and not have that be sort of the kind of work that happens after the workday's over. That actually that is part of people's jobs, is to figure out how to better meet student basic needs.
Yeah. That's really great. Thank you, Ellen. Do we have any other questions from everyone? All right. Well, we might have a few minutes of found time, but I want to give both of you the opportunity to, with any last words you have, before I close it all up. Which one would like to go first? Richard?
Sure, why not? I guess two things I would say, I guess as an advocate myself, like advocacy is really key in driving a lot of these things forward. And so definitely like from grassroots coalitions to national foundations, I think advocates play a critical role in pushing a lot of this work forward. And so, I would encourage advocates to like to continue fighting regardless of the challenges that may, present itself in the upcoming years. But really trying to drive that work forward and really, finding energy and support and knowing that you're meeting students' basic needs is really important. And also, Emil mentioned this earlier, but I think addressing basic needs and security is really integral from advancing racial equity. So even though students of color are disproportionately affected by these challenges, and really policies in this area must be designed to close the gap. And so those are two things that I want people to take away from this conversation is really just to kind of keep the energy up, keep the fight going, and remember like kind of our North Star, which is racial equity.
And then to add to that, build champions. Like that's some of the work that we saw in some of the states was repeated names year after year from legislative sessions of the same legislator advancing the next piece of legislation that's coming down the line. And that's hard work that entails investing a lot of time in a person and their staff, and there are things that are outside your control, sometimes like term limits and that kind of thing. But using some of that energy has to be to go into building champions, whether it's a champion as the president of your institution, student government association, politicians, like I said, a champion in terms of being the head of the Department of Social Services, all of those things that champions can help play a role in long-term commitment to addressing some of these issues.